In a small town in Alabama, where the air was thick with humidity and the sun blazed down on fields of cotton and corn, an unusual scene unfolded inside the local courthouse. The building itself was old, its white walls chipped and faded from years of weathering. Inside, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of people who had gathered to witness what promised to be an intriguing case. At the center of it all stood a young boy named Elijah Johnson, his hands clasped tightly together as he faced the imposing figure seated above him, Judge Franklin Hayes. Elijah wasn't like the other boys in town. While most kids his age spent their days playing baseball or fishing by the creek, Elijah worked alongside his grandmother, Ruth Johnson, tending to the family farm. It wasn't just any farm. It was land that had been passed down through generations of Johnsons dating back to when slavery still stained the nation's history. For Elijah, the farm wasn't just property. It was a piece of his family's soul, a testament to their survival and resilience. But now that land was at risk, and Elijah found himself standing in court, fighting for something far bigger than himself. The trouble began when a wealthy businessman claimed that the land rightfully belonged to him. According to the man, the Johnsons had no proof of ownership because all their documents had burned in a fire decades earlier. Without official papers, the law seemed to side with the businessman, leaving Elijah and his grandmother with little hope. Still, they refused to give up. They scraped together every penny they had to hire a lawyer, but even then, things didn't look good. Today, they were here. Not because they expected miracles, but because they believed in justice, however distant it might seem. Elijah looked up at Judge Hayes, who sat behind a large oak desk, his expression unreadable. The judge was known throughout the county for his sternness and sharp tongue. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it often came across as more of a sneer than anything warm or friendly. His reputation preceded him, and many whispered that he favored those with money and power over ordinary folks like the Johnsons. As Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his worn-out shoes, he couldn't help but feel intimidated. This wasn't just a courtroom. It felt like a battlefield, and he was woefully outmatched. Beside Elijah sat his grandmother, Ruth, her frail frame leaning heavily on her cane. Despite her age, there was fire in her eyes, a determination that hadn't dimmed even after years of hardship. She reached over and patted Elijah's hand gently, offering silent reassurance. "We've fought harder battles than this," she murmured softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Elijah nodded, though deep down he wasn't so sure. This wasn't just about farming anymore. It was about dignity, about proving that they mattered in a world that often tried to push them aside. As the proceedings began, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. The businessman's lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, laid out his argument with practiced ease. He spoke confidently, painting the Johnsons as careless and disorganized, implying that they had simply neglected to keep proper records. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he stepped forward hesitantly, his heart pounding in his chest. He cleared his throat and began to explain how the fire had destroyed everything, how his family had always taken care of the land, and how they had never doubted that it was theirs. But before Elijah could finish, Judge Hayes interrupted him with a scoff. "Another one of these lost papers stories," the judge said dismissively, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, and fixed Elijah with a cold stare. "What makes you think anyone would believe such nonsense from someone like you?" The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. Someone like you. The phrase echoed in his mind, heavy with meaning. Was the judge referring to his race? His youth? Or maybe both? Whatever the intention, it stung. Elijah glanced at his grandmother, searching for guidance. Ruth's jaw tightened, but she gave him another reassuring nod, urging him to stay strong. Determined not to let the judge's arrogance get the better of him, Elijah took a deep breath and continued. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "I may not have fancy clothes or expensive lawyers, but my family has worked this land since before your grandfather was born." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air, bold and unyielding. Even Judge Hayes seemed momentarily taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with irritation. "What do you know about deeds, boy?" the judge snapped, his voice rising. "Do you even understand what a legal document is?" He paused, waiting for a response, but Elijah stood firm, refusing to back down. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Spectators exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. It was clear that Judge Hayes had no intention of making this easy for Elijah. With each passing moment, his comments grew sharper, more cutting. "Respect this court," he barked, slamming his gavel down hard enough to make the wooden bench tremble. The sound reverberated through the room, jolting everyone to attention. Yet beneath the judge's harsh exterior, there was something else. A flicker of discomfort, perhaps, or maybe even guilt. Whatever it was, it went unnoticed by most, buried beneath layers of arrogance and authority. As the hearing dragged on, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were stacked against him. The businessman's lawyer smirked smugly, clearly, confident in his client's victory. Even some of the spectators seemed skeptical, whispering among themselves about whether Elijah truly had a case. But amidst the doubt and derision, one thing remained certain. Elijah wasn't going to give up. No matter how daunting the challenge, he was determined to fight for what was right, for his family, for their legacy, and for the truth. Little did anyone know, however, that the events unfolding in that courtroom were about to take a dramatic turn, one that would leave everyone stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Hayes continued to mock Elijah, his words cutting deeper with each passing moment. "Do you really expect us to take your word over proper documentation?" the judge asked, leaning back in his chair, with an air of superiority. His tone was laced with disbelief, as if Elijah's very presence in the courtroom was an affront to justice itself. The spectators murmured quietly among themselves, some nodding in agreement with the judge while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to make of the situation. Elijah clenched his fists tightly at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the weight of the judge's words pressing down on him, but he refused to let them break his spirit. Beside him, Ruth whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "Stay strong, Elijah," she said, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We've been through worse than this." Her words were meant to comfort him, but even she couldn't hide the frustration in her eyes as she glared at the judge. She had lived long enough to know that fairness wasn't always guaranteed, especially for people like them. The businessman's lawyer seized the opportunity to pile on more pressure. Smiling smugly, he stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and polished. "It's clear that the defendant has no real evidence to support his claim. All we have here is a story. No papers, no proof. Nothing credible." He turned to face Elijah, his expression dripping with condescension. Perhaps it's time for the young man to accept reality and move on. Elijah felt his cheeks burn with anger, but he bit his tongue, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. He looked around the room, meeting the gazes of the people watching him. Some looked sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few seemed outright hostile. It was hard not to feel small under their scrutiny, but somewhere deep inside, he found a spark of determination. This wasn't just about him. It was about his family, about proving that they weren't liars or thieves. They had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let someone take their land away without a fight. Judge Hayes, seemingly satisfied with the direction things were going, leaned forward again, his gavel poised in his hand. "Is there anything else you'd like to say, boy?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Or are you ready to admit defeat?" For a brief moment, Elijah hesitated. The weight of the situation threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about all the nights his grandmother had spent telling him stories of their ancestors, of how they had endured unimaginable hardships to keep the farm alive. He thought about the countless hours he had spent working in the fields, learning the value of every inch of soil. and he thought about the fire that had destroyed their records, reducing years of hard work to ashes in a single night. Could he really stand there and tell this room full of strangers that none of it mattered? That his family's legacy was worth less than a piece of paper? "No, Your Honor," Elijah finally replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm not giving up." The words came out stronger than he expected, earning a few surprised looks from the crowd. Even Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow, momentarily caught off guard by the boy's defiance. Before the judge could respond, the doors of the courtroom burst open with a loud creak, causing everyone to turn their heads. A tall, distinguished man strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his shoes gleaming under the dim lights of the room. Behind him followed two assistants carrying stacks of folders and documents. The man's arrival sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd, and whispers erupted as people recognized him instantly. It was Henry Dawson, a well-known civil rights attorney whose name had become synonymous with fighting for justice in cases involving racial inequality. Henry had built a reputation for taking on seemingly impossible battles and winning them, often against powerful opponents who underestimated him. His sudden appearance in this small-town courthouse was unexpected, to say the least, and it left everyone wondering why he was there. Henry made his way to the front of the room, his steps deliberate and confident. When he reached the bench, he paused and addressed Judge Hayes directly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm yet firm, "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe there are facts in this case that need clarification." The judge frowned, clearly irritated by the intrusion, but before he could protest, Henry turned to Elijah and smiled warmly. "Young man," he said, extending a hand, "my name is Henry Dawson, and I'm here to help." Elijah stared at him, momentarily speechless. He glanced at his grandmother, who looked equally stunned, her mouth slightly agape. Slowly, Elijah shook Henry's hand, feeling a surge of hope rise within him. For the first time that day, it felt like the tide might actually be turning in their favor. As Henry began organizing his materials, Judge Hayes grew increasingly agitated. "Mr. Dawson," he snapped, his patience wearing thin, "what exactly is the purpose of your involvement in this matter?" His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, but Henry remained unfazed. He simply adjusted his glasses and replied, "To ensure that justice is served, Your Honor, nothing more, nothing less." The businessman's lawyer, visibly unsettled by Henry's arrival, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he interjected, "this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of proceedings and I assure you," Henry interrupted smoothly, "that my presence will only serve to clarify matters. Trust me, Your Honor, this case is far from straightforward." With that, he opened one of the folders and pulled out a document, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," he announced, "is a copy of the original deed to the land in question. It proves beyond any doubt that the property belongs to the Johnson family." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as people craned their necks to get a better look at the document. Even Judge Hayes seemed taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with skepticism. "And where did you obtain this so-called evidence?" he demanded, his voice tinged with suspicion. Henry smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "From a very reliable source," he replied cryptically. Then, without waiting for further questions, he placed the document on the judge's desk and stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone waited anxiously to see what would happen next. For Elijah, the moment felt surreal. Just minutes ago, he had been bracing himself for defeat, convinced that the odds were insurmountable. Now, with Henry Dawson standing beside him and undeniable proof in hand, he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they might actually win. But as he glanced at the judge, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. Something about the way Judge Hayes stared at the document, his brow furrowed in thought, suggested that the drama was far from over. Unbeknownst to anyone in the room, the events unfolding were about to take an even more shocking turn, one that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the case, the judge, and the truth itself. Henry Dawson stood confidently at the front of the courtroom, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that filled the air. The document he had placed on the judge's desk lay there like a silent accusation, its presence demanding attention. Judge Hayes stared at it for what felt like an eternity, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden surface. For a man known for his quick wit and sharp tongue, he suddenly seemed unsure, almost hesitant. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, everyone waiting to see how he would respond. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Dawson," he began, his voice steady but tinged with irritation, "even if this document is legitimate, it doesn't change the fact that the plaintiff has raised serious concerns about the validity of the Johnson family's claim." He glanced at the businessman's lawyer, who nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have the judge on his side again. Henry didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, as if he had anticipated this reaction. "Your Honor," he replied, his tone, polite yet firm. The authenticity of the deed can be verified by experts. But more importantly, I'd like to present additional evidence that sheds light on the true history of this land. With that, he signaled to one of his assistants, who handed him a large envelope. Henry opened it carefully and pulled out a photograph, holding it up for everyone to see. The image was old and slightly faded, but the figures in it were unmistakable. It showed two men standing side by side in front of a modest farmhouse, their faces weathered but smiling. One of them was unmistakably a younger version of Judge Franklin Hayes himself, dressed in overalls and holding a farming tool. The other man was Elijah's great-grandfather, Jacob Johnson, whose resemblance to Elijah was uncanny. Behind them stretched acres of fertile land, the very same land now at the center of the dispute. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people recognized the significance of the photograph. Some leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to get a better look, while others whispered excitedly to their neighbors. Even the businessman's lawyer looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, the balance of power tilting away from the judge and toward Henry Dawson. Judge Hayes froze, his face turning pale as he stared at the photograph. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For a moment, he seemed like a different person entirely, vulnerable, shaken, almost human. Then slowly realization dawned on his face and he slumped back into his chair, his usual arrogance replaced by something close to shame. Henry stepped closer to the bench, his voice softening but still carrying authority. "Your Honor," he said, "you may not remember this, but you and Jacob Johnson were once close friends. You worked together on this land, side by side, during a time when such friendships were rare and often dangerous. Somewhere along the way, life took you down different paths, but the connection between your families remains undeniable." The room fell silent once again, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. Elijah looked from the photograph to the judge, his mind racing. He had heard stories from his grandmother about how their family had helped neighbors in need, regardless of race or background, but he never imagined that one of those neighbors could be Judge Hayes himself. It was almost too incredible to believe. Ruth Johnson, who had been sitting quietly until now, suddenly spoke up. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her words were clear and powerful. "Franklin," she said, using the judge's first name, for the first time, "I know you remember my husband, James. You two used to joke about planting the biggest pumpkin in the county. Do you really think he'd want you treating our grandson this way?" The use of his name startled Judge Hayes, and he looked directly at Ruth for the first time. There was pain in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that betrayed the walls he had built around himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he lowered his gaze, avoiding the piercing stare of the elderly woman who had once called him a friend. Elijah watched the exchange, his heart pounding. He couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and even a strange sense of pity for the man seated above him. This wasn't the arrogant judge who had mocked him earlier. This was someone grappling with memories he had long buried. Whatever bitterness or prejudice Judge Hayes harbored, it seemed to stem not from malice but from forgetting the lessons of his past. Henry seized the opportunity to drive his point home. "Your Honor," he continued, addressing the judge respectfully, "this case isn't just about property lines or legal documents. It's about honoring the bonds that once united us, even in the face of adversity. By ruling against the Johnson family, you're not only betraying their legacy, you're also betraying a part of yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Judge Hayes sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as if trying to steady himself. The courtroom waited, holding its breath, as the man wrestled with his conscience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed deeply and stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Court is adjourned for 15 minutes, he announced abruptly, his voice hoarse. Without another word, he disappeared into his chambers, leaving behind a room buzzing with speculation. People exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the judge's sudden retreat. Had the photograph and Ruth's words struck a nerve? Or was this just a temporary pause before he returned to his usual ways? Elijah turned to Henry, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Do you think he'll change his mind?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "We've done all we can," he replied. "Now it's up to him to decide what kind of man he wants to be." As they waited for the judge to return, Elijah reflected on everything that had happened. From the moment he stepped into the courtroom, he had felt like an outsider, someone unworthy of being heard. But now, thanks to Henry's intervention and the shocking revelation of the photograph, he realized that the truth had a power of its own. It didn't matter how much money or influence someone had, the truth always found a way to surface sooner or later. 15 minutes passed quickly, though it felt like hours. When Judge Hayes reemerged, his expression was unreadable. He took his seat silently, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. Then, without preamble, he addressed Elijah directly. "Young man," he began, his voice softer than before, "I owe you and your family an apology." The words sent a ripple through the crowd, and Elijah's jaw dropped in disbelief. Never in his wildest dreams had he expected the judge to admit fault, let alone apologize. "I allowed my biases and assumptions to cloud my judgment," Judge Hayes continued, his tone sincere. "But no matter what happens today, know that I will personally ensure that justice is served." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, applause broke out, starting with Ruth and spreading to the rest of the spectators. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense weight, a sign that forgiveness and redemption were still possible, even in the most unlikely of places. As the hearing resumed, the momentum had clearly shifted. With the evidence presented and the judge's newfound willingness to listen, it became clear that the Johnson family's claim was valid. The businessman's lawyer tried to argue further, but his efforts fell flat, overshadowed by the overwhelming truth of the situation. By the end of the day, the court ruled in favor of Elijah and his grandmother, officially recognizing their ownership of the land. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around the group, eager to capture the historic moment. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions flew from every direction. But Elijah barely noticed. He hugged his grandmother tightly, tears streaming down his face as he thanked her for never giving up. Beside them, Henry Dawson smiled warmly, satisfied that justice had prevailed. Though the ordeal had tested Elijah's faith and resolve, it ultimately strengthened his belief in fairness and forgiveness. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, gazing out at the fields that had been saved, he felt a profound sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, but the victory was sweeter than he ever imagined. And deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning, a new chapter for his family and for the land they loved so dearly. The sun was beginning to set as Elijah and his grandmother Ruth stepped out of the courthouse, their hearts still racing from the whirlwind of events that had unfolded inside. Reporters surrounded them, shoving microphones in their faces and shouting questions about how they felt, what it meant to win, and whether they trusted Judge Hayes's sudden change of heart. For a moment, Elijah felt overwhelmed by the chaos, but Ruth placed a firm hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Just breathe, child," she whispered, her voice steady despite the commotion. "We've earned this moment." Henry Dawson stood nearby, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. He had seen many cases like this one, cases where justice seemed impossible, where the system appeared rigged against those who needed it most. But this victory felt different. There was something deeply personal about it, not just for the Johnson family, but for everyone involved, including Judge Hayes. As Henry glanced back at the courthouse doors, he couldn't help but wonder what was going through the judge's mind now. Inside the courthouse, Franklin Hayes sat alone in his chambers, staring blankly at the photograph Henry had shown earlier. The image haunted him, stirring memories he had long buried beneath years of ambition and self-preservation. He remembered Jacob Johnson vividly, the man's laughter echoing across the fields, the way he always carried an extra canteen of water for anyone who needed it, and the countless hours they had spent working together under the Alabama sun. Back then, Franklin hadn't thought twice about their friendship. It had been natural, almost effortless. But as time went on, life became more complicated. Friendships like theirs were frowned upon, even dangerous, and Franklin had slowly distanced himself, convincing himself that moving forward meant leaving certain parts of his past behind. Now, sitting in silence, he realized how wrong he had been. His arrogance in court wasn't just about dismissing Elijah. It was about denying a piece of himself, a part of his history that he had tried so hard to forget. The photograph reminded him of the values he once held dear: kindness, fairness, and respect for others regardless of their background. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of those principles, allowing bitterness and prejudice to take root instead. The weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Outside, Elijah finally managed to break free from the reporters, retreating to a quieter corner of the courthouse steps. He looked out at the horizon, where the sky blazed with hues of orange and pink. It was a breathtaking sight, one that filled him with both relief and reflection. Winning the case didn't erase the pain of the day, the mocking words, the doubt cast on his family's integrity. But it gave him hope. Hope that truth could prevail, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Hope that people could change, even if it took a lifetime to confront their own flaws. Ruth joined him after a while, leaning on her cane as she gazed at the sunset. "You did good today, Elijah," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "Your great-grandfather would be proud too." Her words brought tears to his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. He didn't want to cry, not here, not now. Instead, he nodded and smiled faintly, feeling a deep connection to the generations of Johnsons who had come before him. This land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was a symbol of survival, resilience, and love. As the crowd began to disperse, Henry approached them, his expression warm but thoughtful. "You should take some time to rest," he advised, addressing Ruth. "Today was a big day for all of us." She chuckled lightly, waving off his concern. "Rest is for tomorrow," she replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Tonight, we celebrate." Henry laughed, shaking his head. "Fair enough," he said. Turning to Elijah, he added, "This is just the beginning, you know. People will remember this case for years to come. You've set an example for others to follow." Elijah listened, quietly, absorbing Henry's words. He knew the attorney was right. This victory wasn't just about his family. It was about showing others that no matter how daunting the challenge, standing up for what's right was always worth it. Still, the thought of being seen as an example made him uneasy. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He simply wanted to protect his family's legacy and ensure that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same battles. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Hayes made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in decades. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Hello? it said cautiously. Jacob, Franklin said, his voice trembling slightly. It's me, Franklin. There was a long pause on the line, followed by a soft chuckle. Franklin Hayes, is that really you? I haven't heard from you in ages. I know, Franklin admitted, guilt weighing heavily on his words. And I'm sorry for that. I wanted to call because... He hesitated, unsure of how to continue. How do you apologize for years of neglect and misunderstanding? How do you explain that you let fear and pride dictate your actions? Jacob's tone softened. What is it, Franklin? Spit it out. Taking a deep breath, Franklin plunged ahead. I saw a picture today, a picture of us from years ago. It reminded me of everything we shared, everything I walked away from. I was wrong, Jacob. Wrong to distance myself, wrong to forget the lessons you taught me, and I need you to know that I regret it. The line went silent again, and for a moment Franklin feared he had ruined whatever remained of their friendship. But then Jacob spoke, his voice gentle yet firm. Regret doesn't fix things, Franklin. Actions do. So tell me, what are you going to do about it? Franklin swallowed hard, realizing the truth in Jacob's words. An apology was only the first step. Real redemption required effort. I'll start by fixing my mistakes, he promised, starting with the Johnson family. They deserve better than how I treated them today. Jacob sighed, but there was a hint of approval in his tone. That's a start. Keep going, Franklin. Don't stop until you've made things right. After hanging up, Franklin sat in silence for a while, letting the conversation sink in. He knew repairing the damage he had caused wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of purpose, a chance to reclaim the person he used to be. Back outside, Elijah and Ruth decided to walk home together, leaving the noise of the courthouse behind. The evening air was cool and refreshing, carrying with it the scent of freshly tilled soil. As they strolled along the dirt path leading to their farm, Elijah felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. With his grandmother by his side and the support of allies like Henry Dawson, he believed anything was possible. When they reached the farmhouse, Ruth stopped and turned to Elijah, her eyes shining with wisdom. Life will test you again, child, she said. But remember this, every storm passes eventually. All you have to do is hold on tight and keep moving forward. Elijah nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for the woman who had raised him. Thank you, Grandma, he said, hugging her tightly, for everything. As night fell over the farm, the stars emerged one by one, casting a gentle glow over the fields. Elijah stood outside for a while longer, gazing up at the vast sky. He thought about the journey that lay ahead, not just for him and his family, but for the community as a whole. Justice had been served today, but the fight for equality and understanding was far from over. Still, he believed in the power of perseverance, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and as long as he had that belief, he knew he could overcome anything. In the days that followed, news of the case spread throughout the town and beyond. People talked about Elijah's courage, Ruth's resilience, and Judge Hayes's unexpected apology. Some praised the outcome, while others criticized it, arguing that the legal system shouldn't bend to emotion. But for those who truly understood the significance of the ruling, it represented more than just a verdict. It was a reminder that change was possible, even in the unlikeliest of places. For Judge Hayes, the experience marked the beginning of a new chapter. He took a leave of absence from the bench, using the time to reflect on his life and reconnect with old friends like Jacob Johnson. Slowly but surely, he began rebuilding bridges he had burned long ago, determined to make amends for his past mistakes. As for Elijah, he returned to the fields with a renewed sense of purpose. The land was safe, but there was still work to be done, not just on the farm, but within himself. He vowed to honor his ancestors' legacy by continuing to fight for justice, not just for his family, but for everyone who faced similar struggles. In doing so, he hoped to inspire others to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult the battle might seem. And so, as the sun rose over the Alabama countryside, casting its golden light on the fields of cotton and corn, Elijah Johnson stood tall, ready to embrace whatever the future held. The scars of the past might never fully heal, but they served as reminders of where he came from and where he was going. The weeks following the court case brought a mix of emotions for everyone involved. For Elijah Johnson, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The farm, once clouded by uncertainty, now stood as a symbol of triumph, a testament to his family's strength and perseverance. Each morning he woke up before sunrise just like always, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. He no longer walked through the fields with fear or doubt. Instead, he moved with purpose, knowing that every seed he planted carried forward the legacy of those who came before him. Ruth Johnson, Elijah's grandmother, seemed to grow younger with each passing day. Her spirit, which had been tested by years of hardship, now radiated with pride. She spent her mornings tending to the vegetable garden near the house, humming old hymns under her breath while keeping an eye on Elijah as he worked. Occasionally, she would call out words of advice or encouragement, her voice carrying across the land like a gentle breeze. Though her body was frail, her mind remained sharp, and she often reminded Elijah of the lessons she had learned from her parents and grandparents. "We didn't survive all those years just to give up," she would say. "This land is more than dirt. It's our story." Meanwhile, Judge Franklin Hayes found himself grappling with the aftermath of his public apology. Word of his connection to the Johnson family spread quickly throughout the small town, sparking conversations among neighbors and colleagues alike. Some praised him for owning up to his mistakes, calling it a rare act of humility in a world filled with arrogance. Others were skeptical, questioning whether his apology was sincere or simply a way to save face. The scrutiny weighed heavily on him, but he accepted it as part of the process, part of making things right. During his leave of absence, Franklin decided to visit the old farmhouse where he and Jacob Johnson had once worked together. It had been years since he'd set foot on the property, and seeing it again stirred a flood of memories. The house itself was weathered, its paint peeling and roof sagging slightly, but it still stood strong against the elements. As he walked around the yard, running his fingers over the rusted tools left behind, he could almost hear Jacob's laughter echoing in the air. Franklin called Jacob later that evening, sharing his reflections from the visit. "I forgot how peaceful this place was," he admitted. "Being here made me realize how much I missed, not just you, but everything we used to stand for." Jacob listened quietly, letting Franklin speak without interruption. When the judge finally fell silent, Jacob responded with simple yet profound wisdom. "Peace isn't something you find, Franklin. You create it. And if you're serious about fixing things, start by helping others find their peace too." Inspired by Jacob's words, Franklin returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. He resumed his duties at the courthouse, but this time he approached every case with a fresh perspective. Gone was the sharp-tongued, dismissive judge who cared only about procedure and power. In his place stood a man determined to listen, to understand, and to serve justice fairly regardless of race, class, or background. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Lawyers, clerks, and even defendants began to see a different side of him, one that earned their respect rather than their resentment. Back at the Johnson farm, Elijah continued working tirelessly to restore the land. With Henry Dawson's help, they secured funding to repair the damage caused by years of neglect and legal battles. New fences went up, irrigation systems were installed, and crops flourished under Elijah's careful attention. The farm wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Neighbors who had once kept their distance started stopping by to offer assistance or simply share stories. What had once felt like isolation turned into a growing sense of community, one built on mutual respect and shared struggles. One afternoon, as Elijah took a break beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, he noticed a car pulling up the dusty driveway. Stepping out was none other than Judge Hayes, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. Elijah tensed momentarily, unsure of what to expect, but Ruth appeared at his side, her presence calming him. "Be polite," she whispered, giving him a nudge forward. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson," Franklin said, extending his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Elijah hesitated for a moment before shaking the judge's hand. "No, sir," he replied. "We were just taking a break." "I wanted to come by personally," Franklin continued, glancing around at the fields, "to see the land, and to thank you for reminding me of something important. Sometimes we lose sight of what truly matters, but your courage, it brought me back to myself." His words caught Elijah off guard, but he nodded slowly, accepting them with grace. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. "That means a lot." The two men stood in awkward silence for a moment before Ruth stepped forward, breaking the tension with her characteristic warmth. "Well, don't just stand there, Franklin," she said with a chuckle. "Come inside and have some lemonade. We've got plenty to go around." Over glasses of cool lemonade, the three of them talked about the past, present, and future. Franklin spoke openly about his regrets and his plans to use his position to advocate for fairness and equality. Ruth shared stories of the farm's history, painting vivid pictures of the struggles and joys that shaped their family. And Elijah listened intently, feeling a deep connection to the people around him, not just as individuals, but as part of a larger tapestry of resilience and hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Franklin prepared to leave. Before getting into his car, he turned to Elijah and Ruth, his expression earnest. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, "but I promise you this. I'll do everything in my power to make sure no one has to fight the way you did. Justice should never be a privilege, it should be a right." Ruth smiled warmly, patting his arm. "That's all anyone can ask for, Franklin. Just keep moving forward." With that, Franklin drove off, leaving Elijah and Ruth standing side by side. In the fading light, they watched until the taillights disappeared down the road, then turned back toward the house. The evening air was cool and fragrant, carrying with it the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming wildflowers. "You know," Ruth said after a while, her voice soft but steady, "people aren't born bad or good, they choose who they want to be. That man today, he chose to change, and that's worth respecting." Elijah nodded, understanding the depth of her words. Life was full of choices, big and small, and each one shaped the path ahead. For so long, he had focused solely on protecting his family's land, but now he realized there was more to it than that. The fight wasn't just about survival. It was about creating a better world, one where kindness and fairness outweighed prejudice and greed. In the days that followed, Elijah threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He reached out to local schools, inviting students to visit the farm and learn about agriculture, history, and the importance of standing up for what's right. He partnered with Henry Dawson to organize workshops on legal rights, ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the same challenges he did. Slowly but surely, the Johnson farm became more than just a piece of land. It became a hub of education, inspiration, and unity. As winter approached, bringing shorter days and colder nights, Elijah took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The scars of the past were still there, etched into the soil in the memories of those who lived it, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of his journey, a journey marked by struggle, resilience, and ultimately triumph. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the stars twinkle above, Ruth joined him, wrapping a quilt around her shoulders. "You've done good, Elijah," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Your ancestors would be proud too." Elijah smiled, leaning back in his chair. "We couldn't have done it without you, Grandma," he replied, "or without people like Henry and even Judge Hayes." Ruth chuckled softly. "Yes, well, sometimes it takes a village to remind us of who we are and who we can become." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was a peaceful moment, one that encapsulated everything Elijah had fought for, a life rooted in love, respect, and justice. And as he gazed out at the darkened fields, knowing that spring would bring new growth and opportunities, Elijah felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. After all, he had already faced the hardest parts and emerged stronger because of it. Months turned into a year, and the Johnson farm flourished in ways Elijah had never imagined. The land, once a source of conflict and uncertainty, became a beacon of hope for the community. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now visited regularly, bringing food, tools, or simply stopping by to chat. Some offered to help with planting or harvesting, while others brought their children to learn about farming and hear Ruth's stories of resilience. The farm wasn't just a place anymore. It was a gathering spot, a symbol of unity and progress. Elijah found himself growing into his role as both a farmer and a leader. He began hosting monthly meetings at the farmhouse, inviting local families to discuss issues affecting their community. Topics ranged from crop-sharing initiatives to legal resources for those facing disputes over property. Henry Dawson often attended these gatherings, offering guidance and sharing updates on broader efforts to protect landowners' rights. Slowly but surely, the Johnsons' fight inspired others to stand up for themselves, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond their fields. Ruth, though slower moving than before, remained the heart and soul of the operation. Her wisdom guided every decision, and her humor lightened even the heaviest moments. She took particular joy in watching Elijah grow into his responsibilities, marveling at how much he reminded her of her late husband, James. "You've got his spirit," she told him one evening as they sat together on the porch. Strong, steady, and full of fire when it matters most. Elijah smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Grandma," he replied sincerely. "You're the reason we're still here." Ruth waved off his gratitude with a chuckle. "Nonsense, you did the hard work, child. I just reminded you not to give up." Their bond deepened with each passing day, strengthened by shared victories and quiet moments of reflection. Together, they tended to the land, nurturing it as if it were another member of the family. Every sunrise brought new opportunities, and every sunset marked another step forward in their journey. Meanwhile, Judge Franklin Hayes continued his transformation, earning a reputation as a fair and compassionate jurist. His courtroom became a space where everyone felt heard, regardless of background or status. He implemented programs aimed at educating citizens about their legal rights, partnering with organizations like the one Henry Dawson led. Though some skeptics remained, many came to respect him, not just for his rulings, but for his humility and willingness to admit fault. Franklin also made a point to stay connected with the Johnson family. He visited the farm several times throughout the year, always arriving with practical gifts like bags of fertilizer or new tools. On one occasion, he brought a stack of old photographs he had found in his attic, images of Jacob Johnson and himself working side by side. "These belong here," he said, handing them to Ruth. "They're part of your story too." Ruth accepted the photos with tears in her eyes, thanking him quietly. For Elijah, seeing the judge interact with his grandmother so warmly was a reminder of how powerful forgiveness could be. It wasn't just about moving past mistakes. It was about building bridges and fostering understanding. As spring returned, bringing warmer days and longer hours of sunlight, Elijah decided to host a celebration on the farm. It would be a thank you to everyone who had supported them through their legal battle and beyond. Word spread quickly, and soon neighbors, friends, and even strangers from nearby towns arrived to join the festivities. Tables were set up under the sprawling oak tree, laden with homemade dishes and fresh produce from the fields. Children ran barefoot through the grass, laughing as they chased after chickens, while adults mingled, swapping stories and advice. At the center of it all stood Elijah, greeting guests with a wide smile and open arms. When it came time for speeches, he stepped forward, holding a glass of lemonade aloft. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. This farm isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us, to my ancestors, who worked this land with love and determination, to my grandma who taught me what it means to stand tall no matter what life throws your way, and to all of you, who remind me that none of us are alone in this fight. The applause that followed was heartfelt and thunderous, echoing through the fields like a promise to continue supporting one another, no matter the challenges ahead. Ruth, seated in a chair near the front, wiped away tears as she watched her grandson address the crowd. She knew better than anyone how far he had come, and she couldn't have been prouder. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the celebration began to wind down. Guests lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of the gathering. Franklin Hayes approached Elijah, shaking his hand firmly. "You've built something special here," he said, gesturing toward the bustling scene around them. "Something that will last for generations." Elijah nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without people like you, Your Honor. People willing to listen and change." Franklin smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "Change is never easy," he admitted, "but it's worth it when it brings us closer to doing what's right." As the night drew to a close, Elijah walked Ruth back to the house, her arm looped through his. They paused on the porch, gazing out at the darkened fields. Fireflies blinked lazily in the distance, their soft glow illuminating patches of green and brown. The air smelled of earth and fresh-cut hay, mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby bonfire. "You know," Ruth said while breaking the comfortable silence, "life has a funny way of teaching us lessons. Sometimes it takes losing something to realize how much it means to you." Elijah nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The court case had been a turning point, not just for him and his family, but for everyone involved. It had forced them to confront truths they might otherwise have ignored, pushing them toward growth and reconciliation. "I think we're stronger because of it," he said softly. "All of us." Ruth patted his hand affectionately. "That's right, child. Strength doesn't come from avoiding storms. It comes from weathering them together." In the months that followed, the Johnson farm continued to thrive, becoming a model for sustainable agriculture and community engagement. Elijah expanded his outreach efforts, collaborating with schools and advocacy groups to promote education and equality. He often spoke at events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for justice no matter how daunting the odds might seem. For Ruth, the farm remained a source of immense pride. Though her body grew weaker with age, her spirit stayed strong. She passed on countless stories and lessons to Elijah, ensuring that the legacy of their ancestors would live on. And when she finally drifted off to sleep one quiet morning, surrounded by loved ones, Elijah knew she had left him with everything he needed to carry the torch. Judge Hayes, too, carried the lessons of that year with him for the rest of his life. He retired from the bench a few years later, dedicating his time to mentoring young lawyers and advocating for systemic change. His friendship with the Johnson family endured, a testament to the power of redemption and mutual respect. Years later, as Elijah stood beneath the same oak tree where the celebration had taken place, he reflected on how far they had come. The farm was thriving, the community was united, and the scars of the past had healed into stories of triumph. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was good. And that, Elijah realized, was enough. He looked out at the fields, now bathed in the golden light of another spring morning. The soil was rich, the crops were healthy, and the future was bright. As he breathed in the fresh air, he felt a profound sense of peace. The land wasn't just dirt and plants, it was home, a place where roots ran deep, where history lived, and where hope grew alongside the crops. And as long as Elijah stood guard over it, protecting its legacy and nurturing its potential, the Johnson farm would remain a symbol of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of family.